Two teams, 32 losses, 0 wins. They're the only two teams since the mid-70s to finish with a winless record. And oh boy, did they earn it. Today, we are comparing the 0-16 2008 Detroit Lions to the 0-16 2017 Cleveland Browns. Both awful, both embarrassing, both perfect at losing. But who was worse? Who was the worst loser? Today, we will look at their statistical outcomes. Who had the worst QB play, worst leadership from the head coaching spot, strength of schedules to determine ultimately, once and for all, which NFL team that had an 0-16 season was better at being awful. We're going balls deep. Today's episode is sponsored by manscaped.com/goodsports. Father's Day is coming up, and it's time your dad knows that you are thinking about his hygiene and his body hair. I've already given my dad the Lawnmower 4.0 for Father's Day. No clue if he uses it because I don't ask my dad about his pubes. I've given him the Weed Whacker 2.0 nose and ear hair trimmer, which I knows he uses. And you can get your dad both with the Performance Package for Father's Day. Recently, my dad copied me and grew a beard. Recently, Manscaped added the Beard Hedger beard trimmer, and this is 100% what my dad's getting this upcoming Father's Day. Now, I use the Hedger every week for my beard, and its zoom wheel allows you to easily switch to 20 different beard lengths, and its titanium-coated T-blade cuts through the thickest of hair with ease. My dad is new to having a beard, so this is the one area I can teach him a thing or two since I've had mine for a decade now. Use my link below. Go to manscaped.com/goodsports for 20% off plus free international shipping. All right, first let's compare the Browns and Lions on a concrete statistical rubric. They were both truly dreadful in a lot of categories, but who was empirically worse? Now, in terms of scoring offense, the Browns were a little better at not getting points than the Lions. Detroit scored nearly 17 points a game, while Cleveland was dropping just 14.6 every time they hit the field. Detroit was definitely better for one reason, and his name was Calvin Johnson, aka Megatron, aka Retiratron, because he said, "I'm so fed up with this shit, I'm retiring early and giving you all Vietnam flashbacks to Barry Sanders." In his second year in the league, Mr. Tron had 1,300 yards, nearly 1,000 more than the second leading receiver, Sean McDonald. The Lions were just a couple years removed from playing Josh McCown at receiver, and honestly, it feels like he would have been a decent option in 2008. Calvin Johnson was also the reason Detroit, very strangely, had the fourth best red zone offense in the league. Megatron was responsible for 12 touchdowns on the year, and half of them came inside the 20-yard line, which really speaks to how god-awful the rest of that team was. Football is truly a team sport. The 1977 Broncos made the Super Bowl without a Hall of Famer, and the 2008 Lions went winless with one. Now, the Lions had an all-time great keeping them afloat. And meanwhile, the 2017 Browns' leading receiver was a running back. Duke Johnson caught 74 passes for 693 yards, which isn't really even that impressive. Their second and third leading ball catchers were both tight ends, David Njoku and the great Seth DeValve. Wide receivers were borderline non-existent, a touching tribute to the 2014 Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the real discrepancy between these two teams was on defense. The Browns were 31st on defense, and the Lions were last. But the Lions' defense gave up nearly a full touchdown more on a game-to-game basis. They were so egregiously bad on D that their total point differential was minus 249, while the Browns were only minus 176. only. For reference, the worst point differential in a 16-game season is the 81 Baltimore Colts, who were outscored by 274 points. No fucking wonder John Elway didn't want to play there. No wonder. Now, the Lions defense gave up 517 points in 2008. Third worst of all time. And again, the 81 Colts were the worst in that category. The Lions weren't totally devoid of talent on that side of the ball, but their secondary was really a who's who in terms of who the fuck is this guy? But both teams had the worst red zone defense in the league, and neither could force a turnover. The Lions defense only picked off 4 passes all year, while the Browns intercepted just 7 in 16 games. And of course, as a team, they threw 28 of them. Hard to win when 1 of every 5 drives ends in a turnover, which was the case for the Browns offense. Now, despite the massive gap in point differential, the Lions played in just 1 less one-score game than the Browns. The Lions, though, just happened to get rocked when games started to go sideways. They could go pretty bad, with their worst loss being a 47-10 drubbing at the hands of the Tennessee Titans, a 13-3 team that year that diced them up on the ground. Both Lindale White and Chris Johnson had 100 yards rushing against Detroit's worst-ranked run defense. One area the Lions have some bragging rights is their strength of schedule was more difficult. Detroit was facing tougher opponents than Cleveland. The Lions had a strength of schedule index of 2.5 on Pro Football Reference, while the Browns had an index of just 0.5. Now, I'll be honest, I don't really know what that means. Just that bigger number equal harder teams. And I think that's why the Lions got blown out more than the Browns. Finally, I think it's worth noting that the Lions kicker Jason Hanson hit 21 of his 22 field goal attempts, while Browns kicker Zane Gonzalez made 15 of 20. Do with that information what you will, but I wanted to point out that a man whose career spanned through To Catch a Predator, this Hanson was not the reason the Lions were 0-16.
Why don't you have a seat there and get comfortable?
Jason Hanson, thank you for your service. Ultimately, the stats for both teams are abominable, shameful, and appalling, but I'm giving the edge to the Lions on the strength of their incredibly flimsy defense. So, the Lions were worse statistically. The quarterbacks. Now, there's no doubt that the 08 Lions had more talent in their QB room than the 2017 Browns. But did those semi-talented players play better in that particular season? Detroit's room included Dante Culpepper, John Kitna, Dan Orlovsky, Drew Stanton, and Drew Henson. Kitna had thrown for over 4,000 yards in back-to-back seasons, while Dante Culpepper was viewed as a potential great in Minnesota before his career went off the rails. The problem was none of them could complete more than 57% of their passes, and only Drew Stanton threw more touchdowns than interceptions, throwing 1 touchdown. See guys, I corrected that stat oversight from the 2008 video. Now, in a bit of a surprise, Dan Orlovsky was probably their best quarterback that year. Despite his 0-8 record, Dan threw as many touchdowns as picks and deserves credit a few years later in 2011 when he won the only 2 games for the Colts the year Peyton Manning was hurt. He nearly unsucked them out of luck, which honestly might have saved them from a lot of heartbreak, but that's neither here nor there. While the Lions let 5 different quarterbacks throw a pass, the Browns stuck with rookie DeShone Kizer in 15 of 16 of their losses. Much like the German Kizer, he was unable to find success despite some pretty solid work in the trenches. Sorry, I just watched All Quiet on the Western Front. Kizer threw 11 touchdowns and 22 interceptions. Oof. Maybe his worst pass, though, was against the Chargers when he missed Seth DeValve by about 10 yards. But he was right on the money, hitting Adrian Phillips. He was probably the best of the bunch, but Kevin Hogan wasn't much better than Kizer, and neither was Cody Kessler in very limited action for the Browns. Ultimately, while none of them had Calvin Johnson to throw to, I still think the Browns quarterbacks outsucked the Lions' motley crew of passers. Kaiser wouldn't start another game in the NFL, though he did go on to throw another 2 interceptions in Green Bay. Point for the Browns for having worst QB play. The head coaches. Hugh Jackson said after the Browns' 1-15 season in 2016 that he would jump into Lake Erie if they didn't improve in 2017. That is the greatest moment in NFL history. A head coach owning up to his bet. And his bet being that there's no way his team can be worse than 1-15. And then being worse. And then him keeping his job after 1 victory in 32 tries.
I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
While Lions head coach Rod Marinelli didn't make any bold proclamations like that, the results on the field were just as bad. Now, Hugh Jackson had a track record. Not a long one, but a track record nonetheless. Cleveland wasn't his first coaching gig. His first go-around came in Oakland, where he managed to take a perennially sewer-feeding team and extract an 8-8 season out of them, which should have been seen as a minor miracle. And for his reward, he was fired in Oakland. Yes, a coach who was fired after an 8-8 season was also retained after a 1-15 season.
That doesn't make sense.
The NFL is a strange place. Sorry, a dumb place. It's a fucking dumb place. Jackson was also offensive coordinator for the 2007 Michael Vickless Falcons when Bobby Petrino jumped ship, so he was no stranger to disaster. Jackson worked his way back into the head coaching ranks after a great season as the OC for Cincinnati, where he called plays for the 7th best scoring offense. His quarterbacks were Andy Dalton and A.J. McCarron, so maybe he deserves a little bit of credit for that. Although Battlehawk A.J. McCarron can throw 6 touchdowns in a game with ease.
All fucking day!
But the bottom line is that Jackson finished his Browns career with a 3-36-1 record. There's no getting around that. 2 of those wins didn't come until his 3rd year, after the team had drafted Baker Mayfield. For whatever artistry Jackson may have worked as a Raider, it was all washed in the anti-baptismal waters of Lake Erie. Also, his defensive coordinator was Greg Williams, who is an asshole. His OC was Todd Haley. Less of an asshole, but both are now coaches in the USFL and XFL.
I'm surrounded by assholes.
Haley, a head coach of the Memphis Showboats, and Williams, a defensive coordinator for the Defenders. Now, Lions head coach Rod Marinelli never got the shit that Jackson did. He was ultimately viewed as a good to great defensive mind who simply wasn't cut out to be the head man. Marinelli was a disciple of Tony Dungy and John Gruden in Tampa and had never been a head coach in any capacity before Matt Millen hired him in Detroit. And yeah, I should mention that the Lions, Matt Millen, was one of the worst GMs of all time, which certainly factors into this. If you lived through this era, Millen took the brunt of the criticism in the media. Marinelli actually had the team on an upward trajectory before the 2008 season. He had gone 3-13 in 2006 and 7-9 a year later before the bubble burst and 16 losses ensued. When Marinelli went back to coaching strictly defense, he led top 5 units 3 times in Dallas or Chicago. I'm projecting the same thing for former Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett with Aaron Rodgers.
I choose to be positive.
Can't wait for someone to watch this video in 2024 and respect how right or laugh at how wrong I was about that last sentence. But the edge goes to Hugh Jackson here for worst coach because he eventually spoke to investigators who alleged the team was purposely trying to tank, and given that there was no clear evidence that that was true, it speaks to his knack for sucking in the most efficient manner possible. Another point for the Browns for shittier head coaching. So who is more embarrassing? All right, you knew it was coming. Roll clip.
Here comes Jared Allen, and he's out of bounds. Poor guy, I don't even know if he realized it.
When Dan Orlovsky ran out of the back of the end zone for a safety, it immediately became a picture-perfect snapshot of the Lions' utter ineptitude in 2008. What people don't always remember is that safety happened in a 2-point loss on the road in Minnesota. Their most embarrassing play was also the play that could have gotten them a lone win, or at least a tie, which I have to wonder, is it worse to be 0-16 or 0-15-1? We like to focus on the safety from that play, and for good reason, but this team started their season in Atlanta against a rookie quarterback and a franchise that had been splintered by the loss of Michael Vick and the resignation of Bobby Petrino, and promptly allowed Matt Ryan to throw a touchdown on his first career pass attempt. It's like Detroit absorbed all of the Falcons' bad energy and took the burden off their shoulders. It was actually pretty generous of them when you think about it. Now, the Lions may have ultimately ended Aaron Rodgers' run in Green Bay, but they also gave it a kickstart with this play.
And Rodgers running the Favre-like play action. And Favre-like up top for a wide-open Greg Jennings. Still not down on the turf.
They basically let Greg Jennings put the team on his back. Except they didn't have the hardest hitting safety in the league on their roster.
Darren Sharper.
That was another very winnable game against an inexperienced quarterback, and instead, the Lions snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. It really is hard to top that. It's also hard to top the fact that the Lions were the very first team to go 0-16 in NFL history. Now, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had gone 0-14 and were arguably worse in their first year of existence back in 1976. That's not ideal, but I think an expansion team gets a pass. The 82 Baltimore Colts had also gone winless, finishing 0-8-1 in a strike-shortened year. But 16 losses, that was a new milestone. It felt like the extra 2 games nearly guaranteed each team a win at some point. But the Detroit Lions said, "You just watch. You just watch us do the near impossible." They were a spectacle. They broke new ground. They were pioneers. The 2017 Browns were mere followers, students of their winless forefathers. The Lions were Jesus, and the Browns all the Christians after them. The Browns had some embarrassing moments, but when you think about that season, there's a few moments that do come to mind. They started the season with a 3-point loss against Pittsburgh, a very winnable game if they didn't surrender a blocked punt for a touchdown in the first 2 minutes of the game. They also capped off the season with the final nail in the coffin loss to those same Steelers. Another game they could have won if their former first-round pick Corey Coleman hadn't let a ball go through his hands in the final 2 minutes. Absolute bookends of ineptitude. Very, very impressive, Cleveland. There's also a really funny play in Cincinnati where Giovanni Bernard catches a screen pass and almost looks shocked that no one is even close to him as he jogs down the field for an easy touchdown. Or take this play, leaving Jamal Williams, a guy who prefers to score from the 1-yard line, wide the fuck open at the 2-yard line. They lost that game to Brett Hundley, by the way, not Aaron Rodgers. Despite all of that embarrassment, the Browns, well, they had already established a benchmark of humiliation dating back to 1999. So much so that 0-16 didn't seem that far out of the ordinary. It was almost expected. But I do have to give this one to the Lions. They were first, and that makes them worst. Second place is first to lose. Not here. So that point for the Lions leaves us in a dead heat. So what's my final verdict? Well, I find it fascinating that both of these teams rose from the ashes and made the playoffs exactly 3 years after going winless. Those 0-16 seasons afforded them franchise quarterbacks in Matthew Stafford and Baker Mayfield, who for all of his faults won a playoff game in Cleveland and came within a non-helmet-to-helmet flag to knocking off the Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes a week later. Through 4 categories, we're tied 2 apiece. The Lions had the worst numbers and were more embarrassing, but the Browns had the edge in terrible QB play and a terrible head coach. At the end of the day, though, I'm giving this distinct honor to the Lions, and I've got a strangely poetic reason. In 2008, the housing market collapsed, as did much of the U.S. economy. The city of Detroit, once a booming metropolis and home to the motor industry, had become something of a ghost town. The 2008 Lions were a metaphor for the downturn in that city. In a way, it made complete and total sense that Detroit should have a winless football team. They had been beaten down in life, and they had been beaten up on the field. It felt like football had mirrored life. Art imitates reality. Fortunately, today, the city of Detroit is on the come up, and so are its Lions. Dan Campbell made the Lions fun again, gave them a biting edge that they've lacked since the 2000s. I only wish Calvin Johnson could have played for Dan the Man and Jared Goff, because I think he would have broken 2,000 yards with 17 games in that offense. But the Lions were so oppressively bad that they sucked out his love of the game. 2008 feels like 15 years ago, which actually it was.
That is fucking crazy.
Maybe it feels like longer than that. You get my point. Congrats to the 2008 Lions. You finally won something. Thanks for watching Balls Deep here on That's Good Sports. If you like this video, subscribe and check out more of the Balls Deep deep dives in the Balls Deep playlist here.